Hi, how's it going? This is resident of Collingwood for YouTube, resident _of Collingwood for BitChute, and I'm here to do some read alongs. My first is chapter 4 of For Remains of Judgment, a Dark Shadow story, written by Mark at _Barnabas. So here we go. This is chapter 4, guys. Alan stood there, staring at Victoria, and shivering. He was now freezing. He could smell the heavy autumn air and the trees and foliage around him. Victoria placed her transparent hands on his arm. His eyes flashed toward hers, and his chin quivered from the cold that had suddenly overtaken him. He tried to catch his breath, but the overload of sense and fear caused him to start hyperventilating. "It's okay, just calm down. Relax, Alan. It's okay," Victoria tried to reassure him. Still saying nothing, Alan sat on the ground, huddling his arm around his knees and rocking back and forth. So many scenarios about being lost here flashed through his mind. He tried to dismiss them all, but they were going too fast. Kneeling on the ground with him, Victoria focused on his thoughts. "Listen to me. I won't let anything hurt you. There are things I need you to see, things you need to know and face. I don't have much time. Please come with me." Alan, still shaking, nodded in agreement and took deep, slow breaths. He stood to his feet and began slowly rubbing his arm with his hands to warm them. His knees were buckled together to keep his legs warm. Victoria smiled. "Thank you. You're doing so well. You're a brave guy, Alan. You really are. Let's go inside the house, okay? It's warmer in there." The door creaked open by itself, and the two of them entered inside. Time was still frozen, and everything was still. Alan looked as the lantern that should have been flickering, but the flame was leaning still to the left. A fly was suspended in air in front of where he stood. He reached to touch it, but his fingers stopped, and no matter how hard he pressed against it, it was unable to move it. What you're about to see are moments of the past. You can't change them. Nothing can be moved. Not even the smallest speck of dirt. You're about to see my deepest memories. These are important if you want to save Laura and your wife, Julie," Victoria said as she moved to the dining table. "How do you know her name?" Alan asked. "I can see your thoughts, remember, just like you can see mine. Now concentrate. There will not be able to see or hear you, but you have to pay close attention." Sitting on one of the old wooden chairs, Victoria's eyes locked forward. Her spectral form began to materialize into physical flesh and blood. The lantern began flickering on its own, and the fly buzzed away into the corner of the room. The dark house started to started coming to life, sir. Food began appearing on the table, and three other human shapes began materializing in the fireplace, began to glow, and the cooking spit above it started bubbling to the surface. Victoria, where are we? Alan asked, amazed at what he saw. She didn't respond. Her eyes were still locked forward as the room became a lively dinner scene. Victoria bowed her head and closed her eyes, as well as the forms of the other three were now visible. Alan recognized the little girl as the same one he had seen abused and burned in his dreams. This had to be Laura. The woman sitting beside her had to be her mother. The man at the head of the table must have been Arthur, her father. Laura's mother, Lilith, was a very pretty woman, probably late 20s, he guessed, with unusual deep blue eyes and blonde hair, strands hanging from the cloth bonnet covering her head. She was short in stature, probably about 5'3". She had fair skin and a beautiful smile. He could see how any man could be instantly won over by that smile and blue eyes. She was thin and had a smaller frame, and her dress was simple and designed to be more comfortable than appealing. Laura's father, Arthur, was a bit taller. He looked to be around his own height, 5'8". As he rose from the table and filled his bowl with what was inside the pot hanging above the fireplace, he had dark brown hair that was parted to the left and hung down past his eyebrows. He wasn't a very muscular man, and Alan guessed he wasn't probably much of a handyman. That's probably why the steps and roof were in a bit of disarray. Laura was a mirror image of her mother. Laura's cheeks had a few dirt spots, as if she was told to wash her face before dinner, and missed a couple of places. She was a lively little girl, probably about age 7. Her feet were kicking against the air in excitement for whatever was for dinner. She kept staring at her father and watching him smile as he came back to the table. There was no doubt Laura was a dad's gift. As Arthur sat down, everyone bowed their heads and held hands. Arthur led the prayer, giving thanks for all they had, and earnestly asked the Lord to remember those who had no family or food. When he was finished, everyone raised their heads and began eating. So, Victoria, tell me, where are you from? Laura seems crazy about you and hasn't stopped talking about you since I got back an hour ago. Arthur smiled as he spoke. His voice was kind and energetic. He carried a positive energy about him that made people instantly like him. I'm from New York originally. I grew up in a foundling home until I was 18. I've gone on to work as a governess for a couple of children since then, one boy and one girl. Their names were David and Sarah, Victoria answered, knowing that while telling the truth, referencing and background checks weren't much of a thing yet. It was all about who you knew, and luckily no one here knew her. That's great. Which part of New York? I've visited many orphanages there, Arthur asked. In a foundling home that used to be along the Hudson River. Unfortunately, it's no longer there. Our caretaker, Miss Hopewell, left shortly after I did, Victoria replied. I think that is wonderful, Victoria. Arthur praised her for with a glowing smile. I grew up without parents as well, and had to survive on the streets until I was 16, and had some education. Enough to read anyway. I had a Bible that, sadly enough, I had stolen from someone. I promised God that if He helped me learn how to read it, I would use it to help other kids, like myself, the rest of my life. Did I do something wrong? Yes. Did God use it for good? Absolutely. He helps all kinds of kids that don't help parents, or kids that got no food. Laura looked up at her father, her wide eyes beaming with pride. I can imagine it must be pretty lonely for the two of you. Yeah, for the two of you here without someone great like him to be around all the time. Victoria smiled and looked at Lilith, whom Victoria noticed several times staring at her and sitting silently. I manage to keep us busy. I have my own studies that I utilize in and some friends that I call on occasionally. I actually encourage Arthur in his work, Lilith replied. And differently getting to the point, I want you to stay full time with us. I have my own work that I need to be doing locally to help some needy people here in town. I need someone to stay with Laura now that she is older and does not need me around the clock. I see. Victoria felt disturbed by how easily dismissive both parents were despite their devotions to good causes and people in need. She remembered her time with Laura in 1966 and felt if there was any way that she could stop whatever it was that happened to Laura in her time, she would do whatever it took. This had to be the reason nature seemed to bring her here. I happily accept. I suppose it can be my way of helping the both of you and your causes. I can help Laura, which will give you a little more freedom to follow your callings. Lilith rose from the table, first her eyes glowing with anticipation. Good, Arthur is leaving again after the table was cleared, and I must go to bed soon to get an early start tomorrow. You will teach our Laura. I will pay you 25 cents weekly for your time. This room, the room went black and everyone disappeared from sight. Alan was stuck in a deep void of pitch darkness from behind him. Victoria's spirit appeared behind him. Each day for months, Laura's mother was gone before sunrise and would not return until sundown. She would come home exhausted and was cold toward Laura when she got home. She lost her temper frequently and sent her to her room without food. Victoria explained. A tearful look suddenly washed over her face. I tried intervening and doing all I could to defuse the situation. She lost her temper frequently and sent her to her room without food, Victoria explained. A fearful look suddenly washed over her face. I tried intervening and doing all I could to defuse the situation, but Lilith would have none of it and direct her anger toward me. Sometimes she would apologize, but most of the time she would shut herself in her room and not come out again. Why did you stay, Victoria? Couldn't you have taken Laura away to someone else's? Alan questioned. There was no one here, Victoria wept. This town was so small there was no one for many miles. I had to stay and protect Laura. Arthur would come home very seldom, and I tried to be alone to talk with him about Lilith's behavior, but her mother always stood in the way and stopped me. Lilith often threatened to have me removed from the home and arrested for witchcraft or many other accusations. I couldn't run away because there would be nowhere to go, and I wouldn't be able to stay with her when they would bring her back. I would be put to death, believe me. I have been there before. The law works much differently here. The room suddenly began to fade into view. Victoria moved forward as Alan followed closely behind. I was washing my face before supper, and I heard a loud scream from Laura, and I heard her crying out. Alan jumped as he saw the forms of Lilith and Laura reappearing by the fireplace. Lilith had Laura by the arms and was pressing the glowing end of the iron poker from the fireplace on her arm. Laura's skin was bleeding and seemed black. Victoria came in and wrestled with Lilith, and Laura was lying on the ground, bleeding and screaming, apologizing over and over. Lilith raised the bar to strike Victoria, and she narrowly dodged the blow. The sparks from the hot iron flew out from the impact of hitting the wall. Alan, not knowing what to do and remembering Victoria's line about not being able to change things by being an observer, ran forward toward where the two women were struggling. He reached to grab Lilith, but his hands passed through her like air. He was horrified to realize there was nothing he could do but watch. Victoria managed to get the poker loose from Lilith's hand, but Lilith reached to grab Laura's hair and began to drag her across the floor. Victoria grabbed Lilith's arm and started pulling her away. Alan felt a sharp pain in his head as the scenes began to transition to darkness. Again, he began panting and felt himself becoming increasingly more panicked with a sudden jerk. He closed his eyes tightly and sat up in the chair in Dr. Shaw's office. He looked wildly at the office around him, and Dr. Shaw, who started by his sudden move, jumped backward and stood to his feet, knocking back the chair he was sitting in. Alan was covered in perspiration and gasped as if choking for air. His eyes dilated and watering from panic, he looked at Dr. Shaw. Walls are disappearing, and the young girl is screaming. She's begging forgiveness. Victoria and Laura, he shouted and buried his face in his hands. Her screams, I can't unhear. So that's chapter 4, guys. I hope you enjoyed the read along. Again, the psychology is really good in this because you have the backstory of Laura, of the Phoenix, And that's what Mark is giving you here. And I think it's really, really well written. I love the fact that he's using many characters. He's using Alan, who's a brand new character, and he's using a familiar character in Victoria Winters and her ability to time travel, and also, again, she's a spirit as well. So now I will say, Victoria tells Alan, things are different here. What Victoria is meaning by that is, this is a different time. When Laura was a little girl, times were different. So that's what Victoria is meaning by, you know, she could get easily accused of witchcraft. It happened to her before, that girl knows. So, also, again, she talked about the village being small and really not being able to go anywhere because of how small the village was. Basically, what Victoria's trying to say is there's nowhere to hide Laura from her mother. That's another thing, that everybody is so far away from each other. It's sort of like here in the mountains, like everyone's fought, like you'd have to go a distance to find somebody. So, or living in a state where your neighbor is not as close as you think. Um, Again, back then, villages were, they weren't close together like you see in a city. They were spaced apart. Or, mountainous regions are spaced apart, even, if you will, if that makes sense. I hope I'm making sense of what I'm saying. Um, but I really am enjoying this. I love the characters. I love the scene setting. Mark does a really good job with the scene setting, and the description of what his character is seeing is very, very well done. So that's chapter 4 of Remains of Judgment, a Dark Shadow story. I will do chapter 5 sometime this week, I believe. So I'll see you guys. A link will be in the description box for this, okay? So, see ya.